السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. بسم الله والحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله. So we're in issue 2 in this on page 108 of the book itself. And the author Imam Ibn Rushd rahmatullahi alayhi is going into the issue of the common time for two prayers. We covered some of this before, but this is important to go back to it and kind of review to get the information down and to learn how to read the book and also to learn the methodology of Imam Ibn Rushd. First of all, he says that Imam Shafi and Imam Malik, rahmatullahi alayhi, they disagreed over the last common timing for two prayers. Imam Malik, rahmatullahi alayhi, and that was the Dhuhr and the Asr. So he says that it continues from the declining of the sun for Dhuhr and Asr to an extent of 4 rak'ats for a resident and 2 rak'ats for the traveler to a time is sufficient for 4 rak'ats. So when the timing of Dhuhr and Asr comes in, however much time it takes to pray 4 rakat and 2 rakat at the beginning of Asr and at the end of Dhuhr, that's a shared time, common time. Although in the Maliki madhab, the idea is if you delay to that point, basically without reason, that is sinful, you consider to have delayed the prayer, but your prayer is made on time. So if you catch the prayer in that in-between state, then you have fulfilled the responsibility of praying. And it's not a make-up prayer, it's not a qada, it's an adat. It means that you perform adat, it means that you perform the obligation. Qada, it means that you're making it up. Right? And so that was the thinking that he had. For this reason, thus, he determined the time specific to Dhuhr as the time for 4 rakat in the case of the resident and 2 rakat for the traveler after the declining of the sun. He determined the time specific to Asr as the time for 4 rakat for the resident and 2 rakat for the traveler prior to sunset. It follows that a person who catches only the specific portion of the time of prayer is obliged for the prayer that is specific to this time. If prayer was not binding upon him prior to this time, a person who has more time than this is to perform both prayers together. He fixed the last time for capturing the Asr Salah as that of 1 rakat prior to the sunset. And so here now he's talking about, okay, now he moved on from the time of Dhuhr, the shared time of Dhuhr and Asr, to the time of Asr and Maghrib. Asr and Maghrib. And so he determined that there's a common time between Asr and Maghrib and a common time between Maghrib and Isha. Except that on one occasion he made this the time specific to Maghrib to be the amount of time enough to pray for 3 rakats prior to the break of dawn. And that I don't want to go into that with too much detail because that's really specific to the Maliki madhab. And that's that, the Maghrib and Isha have common timings. And if you caught the Maghrib before Fajr comes in and then you're able to pray Isha as well, then basically you made the timing for the Salah, but that's not the common opinion. That's not the common opinion. And at another occasion, he deemed it enough for the last prayers he did for Asr, saying that it is enough time for 4 rakats. And there's some logic to that. Imam Shafi, rahmatullahi alayhi, we're pausing on that because we want to kind of move on so that we can get a bigger picture because there's some details here which will be confusing to the student, and we don't want to confuse the student. There's some details that are confusing because he's talking about different positions. That's one issue. The second is that we have to have what you call tasawwur al-mas'ala, that we have to be able to conceptualize the issue. So we're trying to keep it as simple as possible so you conceptualize the issue. The only thing I want you to take away from here is that they're thinking about the whole issue of when is there a shared timing between the two prayers or between two prayers. And the rationale behind that is because if you delay salah and you come upon that timing, the question is, did you make your prayer on time or are you making it up? That's why that investigation is there. So the research into the common time between the salah, right? So it'll be like a circle. So that circle is encompassing all of the 5 prayers. And so there's a continuum of time that relates all of the 5 prayers together. So each of those 5 prayers, although it's on that continuum of time, that the day, the night, that's the continuum of time. Each one has its own fixed time. And we learned that before when we were reading earlier in the course, that Allah Ta'ala in the Quran has designated that each salat has its own time. And each salah has its own time and is to be offered at that time. So the continuum of time in which we're obligated to pray is basically a complete 24-hour cycle. The 5 times salah have to be prayed within that 24-hour cycle in order for those prayers to be considered legit, prayed on time. They have to be prayed at specific times during that 24-hour cycle. Each prayer has a beginning and an ending time. And then the issue becomes, each prayer has a beginning and ending time, but then when one prayer ends, another prayer begins. So then the question arises, is there a shared time between them? And that's the issue or the investigation that's before us now. And so for Imam Malik, there is a shared time between the prayer times. And that shared time, what's the obligation of that moment if you hadn't prayed in the early portion of the time? And we talked about that. When is the best time to pray? But now we're talking about the necessity of praying because the time for one prayer is going out completely and it can't be regained again. And the time for a new prayer is beginning. So when you perform a prayer in its proper timing, and each prayer has a beginning time and an end time, then you relieve yourself of the obligation of praying, and that's called adat, to perform the prayer in its due time. When you deviate from that bracket of time, beginning, end for prayer, you deviate and you take the prayer outside of that bracket, you have to have a reason for that. And that reason has to be considered by the Sharia. It just can't be a reason that we make up. So praying the prayer on time, we get a reward, we don't catch a sin. We fulfill our obligation. Praying the prayer outside of its time, you have to have a reason for that. That reason has to allow you to do that. Like for instance, you're traveling or you're combining salah for rain or snow or something like that. And then at that point in time, you can take that bracket of time, rather than it being a small unit of time, it becomes expensive, right? So you have 2 units of time and you combine them together so the time spreads out more for you. So the deen facilitates because of some hardship, like for instance, weather conditions or traveling. Or maybe even being sick, right? And so, but that's another issue. If you don't pray within the specified time, you're still obligated to pray, but you call it a sin. So the whole issue of when is the prayer considered as having been fulfilled is the whole logic here. When is the prayer considered as having been performed, but you didn't make the time issue? You know, that is another part of this investigation, right? And so there's reward and punishment associated with that. May Allah protect us. A person who has more time than this is to perform both persons. He fixed the last time for capturing the Asr. Okay, so he determined similar common timings for Maghrib and Isha, that they had shared time, except that on one occasion he made the time specific to Maghrib to be an amount of time enough for 3 rakat prior to the break of dawn, and at another occasion he deemed it enough for the last prayer as he did for Asr. So now, that may not make sense to most, and that's okay. But the reality is that you have a continuum of opinions as well in fiqh. And so that's like Imam Malik may have had an opinion that he gave on this issue, and he researched it and thought about it, and he came to another position, but that may not be the position that he may hold to. And so that's kind of like a position within the Maliki madhab, that's attributed to Malik, but that's not the general position of what's followed. And so we have to understand that the same thing that we mentioned with Ibn Rushd, when it comes to you have scattered opinions, and then you classify them into groups, that's not only just between madhahib that this occurs, that you have a number of different opinions. Even within a madhab is a methodology of researching, right? It follows certain rules that are clear cut, that can be identifiable. You're gonna have multiple opinions, but not every opinion you follow just because they're out there, right? And so the issue of where's the majority or where's the fatwa. Sometimes where the minority opinion is at is acceptable due to need or due to circumstances or whatever within the madhab itself. But so in this case, Imam Ibn Rushd is conveying to us an opinion of Malik, which is not really Imam Malik rahmatullahi alayhi, which is not really, a dominant opinion. So if you don't understand that type of thinking, that madhabs internally, that sometimes was attributed to an imam, it could be multiple opinions. If you look at Imam Ahmad's madhab, sometimes he has 3 or more opinions on one issue, because in his school, it's permissible to have more than one course of action based on the fact that the hadith legitimizes that. So you can have, and the reason why there will be multiple opinions, because you have different circumstances. So in the time of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, things may have been done more than one way, predicated or based upon different circumstances. And so that just gives us flexibility, right? Some other madhahib, what they do is that they reconcile between all those opinions and they bring it into one course of action, right? And so that's why you need to understand what's going on with the work of madhahib. The madhahib are trying to simplify practice. How do you make sense of scattered positions that are based on a number of different proofs? And are there any questions regarding that, or is that clear, or what? Can I have some feedback here? Again, I mentioned that you can have in one madhab a number of different positions, but when it comes to acting, you're going to have one position that's generally followed in the madhab. When it comes to studying and research within one madhab, you may find a number of different positions. There's nothing wrong with that at all. There's no issue with that. It's not confusing. It's just that you have to understand that science. You have to understand how they're operating. And like for instance, the mashhur or the mustahbi, or the position of fatwa across the board, across the different madhahib, that's how it is. The madhahib, what the madhahib do is they systematize for you research, and at the end they give you, a meal deal, so to speak. It's like they, out of a big menu of opinions, what they do is that they give you this opinion, they simplify it for you and say, follow this. Right? This is kind of where the general tendency is at. The whole issue of combining the salah across the madhab, when it comes to the issue of the salah, the majority, when it comes to the issue of traveling, the combination of the salawat or the prayers has its own rules, but is acceptable across the board, with the exception of the Hanafi madhab, which doesn't believe in combining the prayers based on the each salah having its own time, and if they do combine, they combine at the shared time, so it's what they call an apparent combination. It's not a real combination. A real combination would mean to take one salah, like the Dhuhr salah, out of its time and you pray in Asr, or you take the Asr salah, you pray it in the time of Dhuhr with Dhuhr. That's a real combination of salah, because you took this one salah out of its time and you made it in another time. If you prayed it at the shared times, like for instance, you pray Dhuhr, you wait till Dhuhr is coming to an end, you pray Dhuhr right before it ends, then you pray Asr, that's what they call an apparent combination, or Jam' Surri. It appears that you combined, but in reality you didn't. You just pray each salah in its time and you found the shared time between them. The Hanafis, they have their logic in that, and they only combine in Hajj, right, from my understanding in that regard. As far as the weather issue is concerned, you'll find that the general tendency of the madhahib is not to combine, although it's allowable. And the reason why they combine, the reason why they is because they're not really practicing something which is there, right? So the custom has become not to combine. But the combination of the salawat is due to prayer, due to rain, heavy rain, due to snow that is unworkable. That's from the sunnah itself. And so you find that in the madhab it's allowable, but sometimes the general people, they know an opinion in the madhab, and it may not be that one, and they don't follow that. So some people are really strict on not combining with an excuse. That's an excuse. It's allowable to combine for travel. It's allowable to combine for weather conditions. It's attributed to Imam Ahmed that it's allowable. It may not be the most dominant position in the madhab, in his madhab, but it's allowable to combine under hardship. For instance, work issues. And one of the most easiest resources for that, or references, is Fiqh Sunnah. Although Fiqh Sunnah is not a book for the Hanbali madhab, but it just gives you some access as to what is out there. The position based on the hadith of combining without need, Imam at-Tirmidhi, that you can combine the salawat without need or cause. Imam at-Tirmidhi related in his sunan that ulama al-amsar lam ya'mal bihadha al-hadith, that the scholars from the different regions in the past, the imams, they didn't practice the hadith. That hadith became practiced in this time period. But that's not the general tendency of where the scholars are at. Well, it's not necessarily always on the madhab issue. Okay, for instance, some people may combine the salah. It's not always on the madhab issue. It's based upon the level of knowledge as well. The level of knowledge that people have. And so some masajid, I will say this, that practice of combining the prayers during weather time, That's something very characteristic, not solely characteristic, of the Muslims in America. The Muslims in the U.S., they revived the Sunnah in that regard. And I remember talking to some of the older brothers that are involved in Dawah, a brother that I was pretty close to from Lebanon, was telling me that when they were students, they caught a lot of flack for trying to practice that. Right? And Sheikh Muqbil bin Hadi from the Salafi Dawah in Yemen, he had wrote a book on that issue. Right? And so some of the Salafis began to practice that as well. And the brother who told me was not necessarily Salafi. Uh, the one who told me that they caught a lot of flack. So there were different Muslim groups. They were practicing something that had been neglected, or something which basically fell out of the purview or the attention of the Muslim community, something that's allowable in Islam. So that allowed for a lot of flexibility. And sometimes what you find in the masajid actually is the issue of debate when pertaining to what? Pertaining to whether we should combine or not. So some people, the scholarship has details, and that's kind of where the debate comes out. The issue of whether it's a heavy rain or a light rain, a heavy snow or a light snow. That's where you start finding that, that needs more scholarship for the people to understand it better. Because there's also a custom of the people, so that every place you're not going to combine for everything. Like for instance, in Minnesota, the amount of snow that you get hit with out there is pretty reasonable. Not reasonable in terms of logical, I mean reasonable in terms of size, amount, inches. And so you're not going to combine for everything. That's just the reality. The people there have determined the custom will dictate to a certain extent. The custom of what is a lot and what is little, or what is workable, what's not workable, will dictate. But we haven't reached that level of understanding in the U.S. We started. You know what I'm saying? So each region will be a little different. Like for instance, on the East Coast, in Philadelphia, because Philadelphia was the first capital of the United States, and it was basically a colonial settlement. When they designed the city, they didn't design the city thinking of a large population, and neither did they plan for cars. So it's not like New York City. New York City has a different design plan to it, so that the streets in New York, many of them are really wide, or even Texas, the streets are wide. In Philadelphia, when the snow hits, the problem that you have there is the people are trapped, because you have small streets with cars parked on both sides. You have snow, and then you have the plow trucks that come in. And so when the plow trucks come in, where's the snow taken? The snow is pushed to the side, so it covers all the vehicles up. So in that type of environment, you know what I'm saying, a lot of ways, in some cities, in some parts of the city anyway, it just makes sense that if the snow is going to be problematic, maybe not necessarily due to the large amount of snow, but the way that the snow is managed, that you combine the salah. And so, but that comes to these communities. The communities have to decide that. There's some places where the snow may not be that bad. It may not be an issue of inches, but the weather conditions such as black ice may determine danger, probability of danger accidents on the road. And so it just makes sense for the community to decide how we're going to handle that. And people may live at long distances from the masjid. So that comes back to the community in that regard, to the custom. But is a part of reviving the sunnah. Just as well as praying in the sandals is part of reviving the sunnah. But even with that, we have $100,000 rugs in the masajid. So you're not just going to put on your shoes and walk in the masjid and the community paid $100,000 or $50,000 for a rug, and you're going to say, I'm going to revive the sunnah. You have to deal with the custom of that masjid. But if you revive the sunnah, for instance, in a public setting or somewhere else where it's suitable for you to wear sandals while you're in salah, that's part of reviving the deen. Inshallah. Allahu alam. But that's the reality at the end of the day. That's the reality at the end of the day, that that the combination of the salah is allowable, is encouraged in the sunnah itself under certain conditions. Why? To facilitate for the people, right? The deen is predicated on facilitating practice for the people, right? And so the more that we understand that and we do that, we engage in the practice of the deen in this appropriate way, not in the way of just desire, you know what I'm saying? But we with the conditions that the deen sets out, the easier it is for us to fight our own desires. The deen is set up to protect us from our own desires and the desires of others and the harms of life. Right? And so the more we have confidence in that, and we sometimes we don't have confidence in that because we follow our own desires and we think that that's where the good is for us. The philosopher Plato, I had a teacher who taught us Plato when I was studying philosophy, and he had the theory that Socrates said. Socrates was of the mind, or within that Platonic framework, that we don't do things against ourselves because we believe that they're bad. We do things them and understand it because we think those things are good, or we find some good in it. But just because we find good in it doesn't mean that it's the real good. We could be deluded, because in some situations the good is not determined by reason; is determined by relation. There's some things we don't understand, you know what I'm saying, and there's some things we find that we understand with time, you know what I'm saying. And there's a lot of things in that regard. Scientific knowledge has its own limitations, and that scientific knowledge is a systematic form of reasoning, applied reason, and it changes with time and place. Like at one time they believe certain things about the universe, and then they change. They call that a paradigm shift, but there's in a simple way to say that they were wrong, you know, at that time period, or that opinion stopped being useful. But they don't say that in that way. They say paradigm shift. The paradigm shifted, right? And so the same thing. We are going with opinions in the deen to try to benefit ourselves in this world and the hereafter. And when we fall short in that regard, we make tawbah and we continue, we move on. You know, and sometimes that's a process, a whole life process that we're continuously making tawbah to Allah wa ta'ala. But as long as we have signposts along the way, which is the guidance of the deen itself, that's legit. So that's all. We went off on a tangent in that regard. But Imam Shafi rahimahullah, Imam Malik went. Imam Shafi, he said a single limit for these comments, which is a stretch of time in order for one rakat prior to the salam. And this is for those and this for Dhuhr and Asr together in the time for rakat prior to the break of the dawn, in case Maghrib and Isha together. Let's go back to read that because that doesn't is not so clear. Okay. Imam Shafi rahimahullah, he fixed a single limit for these common timings, which is a stretch of time sufficient for one rak'ah prior to sunset. Really, and then he said this is for Dhuhr and Asr together. If you go into the madhab, you're gonna we ended up losing connectivity. Saying that in his position, let's find it in the Arabic, given that the English is not serving me too well. Just 1 minute, so while we look at the Arabic. Okay. So at the end of the day, Imam Shafi has said in the book, in the translation, that he fixed a single limit or fixed a single common time, and that's that Dhuhr and Asr is prayed before Maghrib. And that's on the assumption of the two salawat having a combined time. There's details of that in the madhab, so you can't go with that 100% and say this is the Shafi'i position. Here, Imam Ibn Rushd is just outlining the major differences between the Imams and giving you a basic framework for how they're thinking, but then the details you have to go into each madhab and see how they work that out, right? So that there won't be any confusion. But you know, here in this case, if you combine the two times together, as long as you made it before Maghrib, then you're on point, you know, and that's the idea there. And the time sufficient for rak'ah prior to the break of dawn in the case of Maghrib and Isha together. It is also related for him that he said it is the moment sufficient for pronouncing the takbir. That is, a person who is able to pronounce the takbir prior to sunset is under obligation to pray Dhuhr and Asr for that day. And so that comes in that makes sense. Like, for instance, for a woman who, you know, she's released from her menses, but in general, the hadith leans more to what? The hadith leans more to if you call a rak'ah, if the time that you have is a time to perform the rak'ah, then you call it the salah. It's not a make-up time, right? But here in this case, for the woman, you know, who is on her menses, and the only time that she has to perform her salah is enough time to pray the takbir, and then she made the salah, and she, you know, that makes sense in that case. Imam Abu Hanifa rahmatullahi alayhi, he agreed with Imam Malik that in the last time for Asr, for those who are under stress or duress, is equivalent to the time of one rak'ah prior to sunset. And so that's similar to what Shafi'i said. But he did not agree about the common timings nor about timing specific to prayers. So the idea here is that Imam Ibn Rushd, he's trying to still find common ground. So he's saying, okay, at what point did Imam Abu Hanifa agree with Malik? So Malik and Shafi agree on some things, and then they differ. And Abu Hanifa stands in opposition to those two. You know what I'm saying? And then here, he shows, oh, well, Abu Hanifa agrees with this part here. He doesn't agree with this part here. That's the thinking of the scholars. You know, that when you get to a higher level of knowledge, that's how they think. They're always seeing the common ground. And that's why I love Ibn Rushd. And the reason why we launched this class. It's not necessary for you to learn all the details of what's being said here, because some of this stuff is above people's heads. But we want you to see how the ulama operate. We want you to be removed from the madness and illiteracy that plagues the Muslim community when it comes to scholarship. We want you to see how the scholars think. We want you to see how it's not just a bunch of chaotic opinions, right? There's a systematization that takes place with thinking. We want you to see how here, for instance, Imam Ibn Rushd is looking for the common ground. It's not compromising the deen to find the common ground and to understand where there's differences of opinion and that stuff which is considered halal, acceptable. So that logic, when we deal with people in conversation, husband and wife, friends, even if we differ on major issues, we may agree on one point. You know what I'm saying? We may reconcile issues here, and then we have another issue which arises, and there may be just one shared point, and that's enough for us to build the common ground. And then we can, from that common ground, we can talk about the other things which we differ on. Right? The Muslim community overall is agreed on the common ground on the basic articles of belief and practice, the arkan of Islam, the usul of iman. You know, those things are all agreed upon. Tawheed, the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, that there's a qibla, that the Quran is authentic, that the Sunnah is, part of revelation, that the Sunnah is necessary in order to understand the Quran. There may be some ahadith which we differ over, but the overall concepts are all there we agree upon. So even if you see the Muslims differing, you always have an understanding that there's things that we do agree upon. And it's only human nature. People have different experiences. People have different insights, different levels of understanding and comprehension. I don't want to say intelligence, but different levels of understanding and comprehension. Although there are different levels of intelligence. But you have to, if you talk about different levels of intelligence too, you have to be respectful. In the sense that, for instance, the intelligence of a child in that age of development is going to be in that child category. One child may be a genius, like, but there may be things that on the adult level of life that child may not comprehend. You know what I'm saying? There may be things that an adult may not comprehend that a child may comprehend. That's why you have children teaching their grandparents how to utilize technology and all that. In any event, the point being is that when we learn how to regard each other, when we learn how to respect each other, when we learn the common ground, then that allows us really to be clear on issues and move forward. And I keep mentioning this over and over again because this is something that we Muslims have to learn. We're so easily driven into emotionalism and opinions, right? I have an opinion, you have an opinion. In the bigger picture, in the political realm, in the realm of military, when you have countries like Yemen and Saudi, when they can't see eye to eye, those differences, they lead to war, they lead to death, they lead to conflict, they lead to problems. You can have a group that has a lot of resources, intellectual resources, skill sets, wealth, and they're working together. And because they can't work through their differences, that team collapses, it breaks down, it can't function. Sure, there's some things that are limits. We agree that we don't pass these, and you break the rules, and it's a problem. That has to be determined. But, there's another perspective on this. Throw that to the side. That's the conflict side. The other side is that we hold hands on everything. And we all smile and mashallah, and it's like, and we sing kumbaya and that type of thing. And some things we don't hold hands on, right? So everything is not just, we just let it go. There's some things which are problematic when we begin to look at the evidences. The evidence dictate that your reasoning doesn't hold any weight. Your evidences are not there. You know what I'm saying? So some positions, whether in Islam or life or reasoning, they just don't hold the weight. We may like you, we may not like you. We may respect you as a human being, but your position doesn't hold any weight. You know what I'm saying? So it's not just a kumbaya concept, and it's just not total conflict, but this has real implications in life, and that's why we keep bringing us back into the circle. Like we mentioned, the Saudi Yemen thing. Yeah, those become differences of opinion over issues, over politics, over religion, over different things, over how to deal with resources, over justice. The same thing with husband and wife. Friends, the same thing. You know what I'm saying? And even in companies, the same thing. So at the end of the day, we want to take that logic from the Imams. The reason for their disagreement. So after all of those opinions are laid out, the opinions are systematized, we see that there's differences, we see where they may have a common ground, and we're coming to the reason now. The reason for their difference, or the reason for their disagreement, is that is the difference between Malik and Shafi'i. So Imam Ibn Rushd, he just didn't leave it at there, because there is a general term. Who is he talking about? Is he including Abu Hanifa in that? Who is in that general term there? So he's specific. That's something we have to systematize our thinking, to become accustomed to clarify meaning. You guys, who are you guys? Clarify for me. You, are you using you in the general sense or you in the specific sense? Right? So you know how it is. You know what I'm saying? Is in a customary sense, defining language is an important part of communication, right? It's not as well as the way that we regard each other, like listening to each other, hearing each other out, trying to understand each other, trying to understand before we draw a conclusion. That's part of the training that we have to have. But there's tone, right? And there's tone, right? So that tone comes in with language. There's gestures. Like I can say, I love you. But that the gesture doesn't match the words. The tone may not match the words. So there's language, communication has different levels, right? And so Imam Ibn Rushd here, he's showing that that's very important for us. He said the reason for their disagreement, so that you're not left out with thinking, who is he talking about? For us, when we use words that are general, we clarify. Some people nowadays, they say, you're generalizing. I can generalize. There's no rule to say don't generalize. I can generalize. But if I generalize, right, there should be a reason why I'm generalizing. Right? In some situations, you may say, the generalization doesn't apply here. Right? All Muslims pray. Right? That's the definition of a Muslim. Right? But we have some people that, are struggling with their prayer. They still pray, they're struggling with their prayer. We have some people that believe that it's okay to be a Muslim and not pray. That's a different debate now. So if someone comes to you say, all Muslims, like for instance, sometimes they say, you Muslims, you divide over everything. Well, again, here we come back to this point. You have multiple opinions on everything, you Muslims, in the general sense. So we say, hold on, there's a common ground between Muslims. There's a common ground, whether we like it or not, there's a common ground between Sunnis and Shia. We believe in the Quran. We believe in the Sunnah. But then in the details of the Sunnah, they differ from us. They say Sunnah, but their definition of Sunnah is not our definition of Sunnah. That's where there's a divergence. They limit what they mean by Sunnah. So some people say, no, the Shia and the Sunnah, or the Shia and the Sunnis are completely different. No, hold on a second. That's not scholarly. Okay? The Shia believe in the 6 articles of faith, right? The Sunnis believe in the 6 articles of faith. Now, on some details, they may differ. And then among the Shia, there's different groups. So the reason why I mentioned this is not because I'm promoting the Shia, is because sectarianism becomes problematic when you don't know how to work with differences of opinion. There's some things between us and the Shia that is like a core difference with some groups, especially among the Shia. For us, we consider some of their practices problematic and some of their beliefs bid'ah. in other points of beliefs, kufr. But that doesn't mean on everything, there's no common ground. That's scholarship. Scholarship is able to find the common ground, able to find where the real differences are, the core differences, and where there's differences just of kind, you know, I mean of type. You know what I'm saying? So that's not a real issue. You know what I'm saying? It's just there's you can have coffee, but there's different types of coffee, so to speak. Right? It's not a core difference, and really we have to systematize our language when we talk about differences. Uh, the Jaf'i madhab. Assalamu alaikum. Assalamu alaikum. So, like we were saying, we were talking about differences of opinion. Imam Ibn Rushd, rahmatullahi alayhi, is not the only one who has a system like this. Imam Ibn Taymiyyah, rahmatullahi alayhi, he also has a system, and he classifies differences into اختلاف التنوع واختلاف التضاد. Those differences of type and those core actual differences, jidri, khilaf jidri, which is at the root, which is an irreconcilable position. You can't bring them together anyway. And so, for instance, in his Muqaddimah to Usul al-Tafsir, you find that Imam Ibn Taymiyyah in his book Muqaddimah to Usul al-Tafsir, or the Introduction to the Principles of Tafsir, you find that he also lays down the system for how you understand differences of opinion. And so he uses a system similar to this, and what he does is he goes back into the history of tafsir and the positions of the Sahaba with regard to tafsir radiallahu anhum ajma'in, and how it is that we understand differences among them. Is it just all chaos, or how do we understand? And so then you see that he comes up with terminology, al-ikhtilaf, al-tanawwu', ikhtilaf, or differences of type, right? It's just differences of type and differences in kind. Is this, or I actually would like to say differences, core differences, to make it clear, right? And so you can, like I said, the example of the coffee. You can have different types of coffee, but it's coffee. You know what I'm saying? And then you have the difference between coffee and soda or pop, depending on however you say it, soda or pop. So those are two different realities. But then if we want to really get more logical, they're both drinks. So the common ground between that, they're both drinks. And when you go more detail in your mind, they're both drinks, coffee and pop, or coffee and soda. One may be a little more beneficial, one may be a little more harmful. Both of them have caffeine. You see, with that type of thinking, when you have the systematization, it's easy to look at a lot of different things, a lot of different ideas, and reconcile between them and find common ground. So in any event, he gives us the two categories of اختلاف التنوع واختلاف التضاد, or a difference of type and core differences, right, or opposing differences. And so Imam Ibn Rushd is not the only one. As a matter of fact, in fiqh literature, in the literature of fiqh being the science, in more specific sense, the knowledge of the halal and haram as it pertains to actions, you find that there's an internal discipline which is called ilm al-khilaf, the knowledge of differences. And that knowledge, everybody doesn't have insights in that regard. Everybody doesn't have the reality of knowing how to work through the differences. The ulama that do, they usually have a system. And I know that here, the camera is not mirroring the board exactly, but I'm pointing to this because we did have a session in which you saw the contents on the board. And so everyone doesn't have a system for dealing with differences. So that's why everyone's opinion is not to be taken wholeheartedly. So in any event, at the end of the day, uh, we see the methodology of Imam Ibn Rushd, the reason for their disagreement, and he defines. We went off on a tangent in that so that we can learn some scholarly methodology. How do you deal with the word they? Well, he mentions they is defined by Imam Malik and Imam Shafi. Is whether the assertion about the common timings for the two prayers together implies that there are two types of timing, a timing specific for them and a timing common to them, or whether it implies that there's a single common timing alone, right? And so that comes back to organization of ideas and how you categorize. That is the differences between them two. That comes back to that type of logical reasoning. Imam Shafi, in other words, the difference between the two is actually reasoning. You know, how they reason, their categorization of the evidences and their understanding. Imam Shafi rahmatullahi alayhi's argument is that combining two prayers indicates only a common timing and not a specific timing to each. Imam Malik, on the other hand, constructed an analogy basing the common timings in the case of necessity upon the common extended timings. And he, that's within his method, that there's a time of necessity and a time when the prayer is extended out. This means that as the extended timing for Dhuhr and Asr has a common timing and an extended timing, it is necessary that the situation be the same in cases of necessity. That may not make a lot of sense to everyone, so we'll leave that at that. And then the issue 3 that comes up, and we'll close with this. The jurists agreed that these timings, that is, the timings of necessity, pertain to 4 types of people. When is there a necessity? In the case of a menstruating woman who entered the period of puberty or who begins menstruating before she has prayed. The traveler who remembers prayer in these times, at a time when he is in a settlement, he may be recalled that he has to pray, or he actually knows that he has to pray, or she, or a settler who remembers it when he is traveling, that prayer is due, right? A minor person who becomes pubescent, or a minor who attains puberty. During these timings, right, there's a necessity which arises. And a disbeliever who accepts Islam, now the timing becomes a necessity upon him or her. They disagreed about the person who has fainted. During that time, the question becomes, if you're not conscious, how can the prayer be an obligation upon you? But they disagreed upon that. Imam Malik and Imam Shafi said that the ruling here is like that of a menstruating woman and is entitled to these timings, for he is not obligated to make up by way of qada. And so the qada issue, we know that if you're a Muslim, the prayer is obligatory upon you. Okay, so then there's some circumstances which allow you to bend the rules a little bit. Like, for instance, if you're traveling, you can combine the prayer, right? And so the normal rule doesn't stand with you in this way. If you're a menstruating woman, you don't have to pray. If you're a pubescent child, you're Muslim, but you don't have to pray. And so the rules, as far as the norm is concerned, what the norm is in some circumstances, you find that there's a deviation from the norm. And so the issue that we have before us now is when are we obliged to pray, and when do we have to make up the salah? When are we obliged to pray, and when do we have to make up the salah? And so